All right, welcome to this explainer. I am honestly so pumped to dive into today's topic with you because we're looking at one of the absolute biggest, most monumental shifts in American history. We're talking about that exact moment when the United States pivoted from just total unchecked exploitation of its natural resources to a system of deliberate preservation. And sitting right at the absolute center of this massive transformation, President Theodore Roosevelt. Between 1901 and 1909, Roosevelt completely flipped the script on the role of the U.S. presidency when it came to nature. He took conservation and turned it into a national moral imperative. So let's see exactly how he pulled it off.
Okay, let's dive right into this number. 230 million acres. During his presidency, Roosevelt used sweeping executive power and legislation to place that staggering amount of public land under federal protection. And to really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of that conservation effort, 230 million acres is roughly the equivalent of the entire state of Texas plus the state of West Virginia combined. Just imagine looking at a map of the United States and literally cordoning off that much land just to ensure it stays protected for future generations. It is an absolutely staggering achievement that forever altered the physical landscape of the country.
Okay, moving on to Section 1, the science of conservation. Pinchot versus Muir.
Now, before Roosevelt could go out and protect all this land, he actually had to navigate a really deep philosophical divide in the country about what environmental protection even meant. Back in 1903, he stood alongside the legendary naturalist John Muir on Glacier Point in Yosemite, and Roosevelt made conservation a national priority by essentially acting as a bridge between two wildly different perspectives on nature. He knew that to save America's wilderness, he couldn't just lock it all away, right? But he also definitely couldn't let industries just devour it.
And this dynamic right here brilliantly illustrates that exact tension. On one hand, you have Gifford Pinchot, who focused heavily on sustainable resource development. He believed nature should be managed scientifically to provide ongoing utility to society. But then, on the other hand, you have John Muir. Muir championed strict wilderness preservation, this deeply held idea that nature is sacred and should be completely untouched by human industry. And Roosevelt's genius? It was his ability to balance these two competing visions. He took the best parts of both to forge a truly comprehensive national conservation strategy.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Antiquities Act loophole, an executive masterstroke. So you might be wondering, how exactly did Roosevelt pull all this off when he was facing a slow, heavily pro-business Congress? Well, he found a very clever workaround. The Antiquities Act of 1906 granted the president the unilateral authority to declare public lands with historic, scientific, or cultural value as national monuments, totally bypassing Congress. Now, what's really interesting about this is how the law was originally designed. It was intended simply to protect small Native American ruins from looting. But Roosevelt? He reads the text, sees the phrase scientific or cultural value, and realizes he has just been handed a massive executive loophole. And he aggressively weaponized this act. Instead of just protecting tiny archaeological sites, he applied it to entire landscapes. In 1908, he used this supposed loophole to completely bypass Congress and instantly declare 1.2 million acres of the Grand Canyon as a national monument.
And he executed this massive land grab directly in the face of what our source describes as fierce opposition from timber and mining lobbies. The corporate interests of the time were furious, but Roosevelt had the law on his side. He used the Antiquities Act to act decisively, locking down some of America's most iconic natural wonders right before they could be privatized or exploited.
Section 3. Professionalizing the Forest Service. Science over cartels.
So Roosevelt didn't just play defense, he fundamentally restructured the way the American government managed its natural resources. First off, he transferred the management of public forest reserves out of the Department of the Interior and over to the Department of Agriculture. This directly led to the establishment of the United States Forest Service in 1905. Then, he appointed Gifford Pinchot, our champion of sustainable utility from earlier, as its head. Through this structural change, Roosevelt placed 150 million acres of timberland under rigorous scientific management. And this was huge because it ensured America's forests were treated as renewable resources for the public good, stopping them from being quietly handed over to private timber cartels.
And all of this administrative shifting built just an incredible legacy. Let's look at the actual numbers here. Under Roosevelt's administration, 5 major national parks were added, including Crater Lake and Wind Cave. 18 national monuments were created via the Antiquities Act, protecting gems like Muir Woods in the Grand Canyon. Federal forest land was expanded by roughly 400%, adding those 150 million acres.
Plus, we see the creation of 51 federal bird reserves, starting with Pelican Island, which basically birthed the National Wildlife Refuge System, alongside 4 major game preserves built specifically to restore decimated bison and elk herds. The output is just absolutely staggering.
Let's get into Section 4, the Midnight Reserves, the 1907 executive coup.
Okay, this brings us to what might literally be the most thrilling story of Roosevelt's entire presidency. It is a true race against the clock. By 1907, Western politicians had had enough. They were incredibly frustrated by Roosevelt's sweeping land grabs, which they felt were totally stifling their local economic development. So they staged a congressional revolt. They attached a sneaky little amendment to an essential agricultural appropriations bill. And this amendment would explicitly revoke the president's power to create new forest reserves in 6 key Western states. Because it was attached to a must-pass funding bill, Roosevelt had absolutely no choice but to sign it into law.
But here's the thing. The crucial point is how Roosevelt responded to this trap. Congress passes the restrictive amendment. But right before Roosevelt signs the bill into law, which, remember, would instantly strip him of his authority, he and Gifford Pinchot basically lock themselves in a room. They work around the clock for days, frantically mapping out new protected areas in those specific 6 states. Roosevelt then signs executive orders protecting all of that newly mapped land. And finally, with the land legally secured, Roosevelt signs the bill that strips his own power. He essentially outmaneuvered Congress right at the buzzer.
And in those frantic, final midnight hours, how much land did they actually save? 16 million acres. 16 million acres of new national forests were created in a matter of days, right before the loophole was closed forever. It is just a stunning display of executive strategy.
All right, our final section, Section 5, a lasting presidential precedent, the blueprint for the future.
Let's slow down for a second and look at the macro takeaways here. Roosevelt wasn't just saving trees, he was completely rewriting the rules of the American government. He established a permanent precedent. Public natural assets belong to all citizens, not to corporate monopolies. His bold, uncompromising use of the Antiquities Act created a template that pretty much every subsequent American president has used to protect public lands. In fact, his administrative groundwork laid the essential foundation for the formal creation of the National Park Service, which would eventually follow in 1916. But it's also super important to remember his balanced approach. Take the Newlands Reclamation Act of 1902, which funded major irrigation projects for arid lands in 20 western states using public land sales. It laid the massive infrastructure for Western agricultural expansion, and it proved that conservation wasn't inherently anti-progress. Roosevelt demonstrated a true dual approach, vigorously preserving wild areas on one hand, while engineering sustainable economic utility on the other.
And it all comes full circle so beautifully. The North Dakota Badlands. This is the very landscape where a young Theodore Roosevelt ranched in the 1880s. It's the place that instilled in him this deep, lifelong reverence for nature. Today, this exact landscape is preserved as a national park in his memory. The very lands that shaped the man are now protected because of the movement he championed.
So Roosevelt's legacy leaves us with an enduring question, and honestly one that is just as relevant now as it was over a century ago. How should we balance executive power and environmental protection today? It's a really complex challenge, but understanding the foundations laid by Theodore Roosevelt gives us incredible context for the conversations we continue to have about our public lands. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.